Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry DeSilva. Well, you know how much I love baseball and the history. Well, we've got the best of both for you. 50 years after one of the most remarkable seasons in Chicago Cubs history, Hall of Fame pitcher Ferguson Jenkins has written the 1969 Cubs, long remembered, never forgotten, published by Signature Strength. And also features a foreword by former teammate Randy Hundley, who we'll hear from a little later on. It also features personal reflections and insights on Jenkins and the team on the season and its aftermath. We got a little video to show you, kind of to set up the season of 1969 for the Chicago Cubs. Let's take a look. All right, back we are, and let's bring on our guest, Hall of Fame pitcher, Chicago Cub, as well as several other teams, but predominantly known as a Chicago Cub for life, Hall of Famer Ferguson Jenkins. Fergie, how are you?
I'm fine, Larry. Things are working out pretty good. Nice and hot here in Arizona.
Yes, not too bad here. Not too bad here. Having a bad hair day, but we'll deal with it. Tell me, how did you and George come together to produce this fine book?
Well, about 8 to 10 months ago, on the advice of a few people, we got together and collaborated to put it together, and we're hoping that people really like what they read.
Absolutely. It reminds me of a book that I read many years ago, a couple of them. One was actually on your rivals, the New York Mets. I want to say it was written by a gentleman back in 1970 called Jack Lang. And again, it was one of these books that really took you behind the scenes of the season. And of course, the other one that I got to read as a young boy was The Boys of Summer with Roger Kahn. This book kind of reminds me very much of that style of writing. You kind of feel like you're, right there, during the season that was, and of course we let the chips fall where they may. And again, I think it's a fine book about the season that could have been better, but nonetheless something for you guys to be proud of. In the book, Randy Hundley, your former catcher during those early Cub years, does a foreword. And we've got a clip of Randy talking about the book. Let's take a look.
My favorite game, I guess, in 1969 was the first game of the season. We were tied with the Phillies going into the 9th inning. And with 2 outs, I get a base hit. I was the 8th hitter in the lineup. And Willie Smith pinch hit in the I think this was the 10th inning that we were playing, and hits a home run. I see that ball going over my head, and I think it's going to hit the wall, and I'm trying to run like crazy so that I can score on it, but the ball goes out of the ballpark, and we were in first place from that point on. And that was a memorable time for me with the '69 Cubs.
Well, there you hear it from his battery mate, Ferguson Jenkins, and of course his longtime catcher, Randy Hundley. Ferguson, how important to your early career was having a regular catcher like Randy working your starts?
I think it's very important because of the fact that I was 22 years old when I became a starter with the Cubs, and Randy probably the same age. He came over on a trade from the Giants, so both of us had to learn all the different teams. There was something like 28 teams in the league then. So it was somewhat difficult from time to time, but DeRozier was a smart man. We had Ron Santo, Ernie Banks. We had some veterans that knew baseball and knew some of the teams. So we kind of ironed a lot of those trouble spots out.
The book, The 1969 Cubs, Hall of Fame pitcher Ferguson Jenkins, along with George Castle, published by Signature Strength. For more information, their website, www.signaturestrength.org. Tell me, did the lack of lights during those years, again, during basically the entire history of the Cubs until probably, maybe the late 80s?
88 is when they got lights.
88, thank you. The lack of lights in Wrigley Field, do you think that hurt the Cubs teams, especially during your era, and others as well, because always playing summer home games and such intense heat, as I'm sure anyone who's lived in the Windy City knows. Yes, it can be windy, but it can also be oppressively hot as well.
Well, the 10 years I pitched for the Cubs, all-day baseball, I think your body gets used to going out on a daily basis, being at the park at 9 o'clock, games start at 1, and the games, sure, it can be hot. It can be humid, but I think the players got used to that fact. There were a lot of sports writers that said the 69 team, because of the fact that they supposedly got tired, the Mets caught us. I think that's all false. I try to tell that in the book. We got plenty of hits, but we didn't score runs. We'd lose 2-1, 1-0, 3-2. It was one of those kind of series or months that you have where you know you should get that clutch base hit, but we just didn't get it.
Very good. Well, we've got one other video, and then we're going to have George Castle, co-author, as well as a friend of the show, journalist and sports writer. He will be joining us. We've got a couple of video clips from two gentlemen that, of course, knew Fergie and know him all these years. WGN, back in the day, Director of Info Services, Chuck Shriver, as well as 1969 WGN Radio Sports Editor, Jack Rosenberg, with a little something to talk about that season of 1969 with the Chicago Cubs. Let's take a look.
I guess my favorite memory is the overall excitement of the year. The Cubs, were in first place for the first time in a long time. There were a lot of people around. It was just a wild year. It's kind of a blur in a way. We had a very small front office then. I think we had 15 people that ran the ball club in those days compared to the hundreds that do it now. So we all had lots of jobs, but we just had a lot of fun. The players were great people. I still have memories today. We still get together once in a while with the players, and it was just a lot of fun.
My favorite memory is watching every one of those ball players on that 69 team stand and sign autographs for moments, half hours, hours, whatever it took. They never turned anybody away. They took it. They didn't ask for anything in exchange, and they became part, literally, of everybody's family.
Now joining Hall of Fame pitcher Ferguson Jenkins is, of course, a friend of the show, has been on several times, Chicago author, journalist, author of almost 20 books, and also better known as the Chicago Cub historian, as well as, I'm sure, a few other things in the city of Chicago, Mr. George Castle. George, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
Tell me now, I know you were working with Ferguson on this book, and actually you had featured Ferguson in your previous book that when we had you on, called Champions. Talk about the process of working with Ferguson on this book.
Well, Fergie made the right call. He thought that there would be a market for a 50th anniversary book on the 69 Cubs, and he was spot on. And I'll tell you why. Because in recent weeks, or I should say all season, all throughout 1969, or 2019, I should say, I have 1969 on the brain here, there have been many articles, there have been many broadcast shows, all sorts of different remembrances of 1969. It's considered one of the seminal teams in Chicago history. And you've had championship teams. You've had the Cubs winning in 2016, the Bears, Bulls, Blackhawks, everything. But for a team that didn't win anything, the 69 Cubs probably had the greatest staying power of any other team in Chicago history. And that's the genesis of the book. And so we had our initial conversations, Fergie and me, back in the summer of 2017. John Schenk accepted our idea, of Signature Strength, I should say, accepted our idea for the book, and we completed the book in the midsummer of 2018, and we're happy to have it out in January at the Cubs convention. And people have enthusiastically received it. It is the team that never stops giving. And sure, on the New York end, there are many remembrances of the '69 World Champion New York Mets, but both teams had an impact for different reasons.
Now, Fergie, of course, as a player, you've got a lot on your mind every fourth or fifth day, probably 4 days, maybe 3 in some cases back in those days. They didn't baby the arms. Did you kind of look at that period of time, '69 and the years, let's say, where you won 20 games for several years in a row? Did you look back at that time and think to yourself, wow, 50 years later, people are really going to, really fondly remember not only yourself, but this team that you played with?
Well, I knew for a fact that they would remember Ernie Banks, Mr. Cub, probably Ronnie Ronsanto, and Billy Williams, some of the veterans on the ball club. Possibly Kenny Holtzman, because that '69 season he threw 2 no-hitters. Beat Bill Hands, won 20 games, first time in his career. Jim Hickman was a clutch hitter. But there was just something about the '69 team, as I said in the title, long remembered, never forgotten, because the fact that we got so close but just didn't get over the hump.
Now, when you came over from the Philadelphia Phillies in 1966, the team already had Santos, Banks, Billy Williams for several years. What, in your opinion, as obviously someone that was there to see it, what was lacking that changed with the arrival of manager Leo Durocher?
We didn't have pitching. And I'll name some of the players that were on that pitching staff. Bill Hands, as I mentioned before, Kenny Holtzman, Rich Nye, Joe Niekro, and myself. We're all in our early 20s, and Leo took us after the '67 season, or before that, he took us aside and said, you 5 individuals are going to have a great spring, you hope, and you'll have an opportunity to be the 4 starters come '67 season. So it was late in '66, after the season was almost over, he took us aside and kind of reassured us that the 5 of us were going to battle for a spot to be a starter in '67.
Now, George, obviously you were there at that time as well, growing up. What was it, as you came to know, of course, Ferguson had to deal with the regime, but the Wrigley family, I mean, it was a different time in baseball. Free agency didn't exist yet. You just had the player draft that had started in '65. What was it about that Cub franchise, like probably so many others? Were they a little tight with the dollar, or what was just the rationale of what was going on there? They seemed to do things a little unconventionally at times.
Well, of course, P.K. Wrigley was known for the College of Coaches, trying to run a team without a manager, and of course, hiring an athletic director who had been the athletic director at the Air Force Academy. Basically, he just did not know that you have to scout, you have to draft, you have to manage, you have to develop better than any other team. It's basics. And he threw in a lot of gimmicks based on his business experience. But the problem with the Cubs there was that Wrigley, even though he had more money than any owner in baseball, felt the Cubs must exist on their own. And when he did not put in lights and did not promote the sale of season tickets, attendance was going to be held down and revenue was going to be held down. And he just did not hire the best and brightest to run the franchise. John Holland, though, his longtime loyal general manager, struck gold on 2 trades, though. And John Holland was infamous for trading Lou Brock for Ernie Broglio, and we could do 3 other shows on that deal. But he struck gold on 2 trades after Leo Durocher had taken over the team as manager. Bringing over Fergie from Philadelphia, of course, Adolfo Phillips a 5-tool outfielder, was the main guy in that deal, although Holland later said that they thought that Fergie had great starting pitcher potential, even though he'd been a reliever with the Phillies. And the other trade was trading Don Landrum and Lindy McDaniel, the closer, to the San Francisco Giants for Bill Hands and catcher Randy Hundley. And those two trades pretty much rounded out the core of the '69 Cubs. But what was lacking was a good farm system where you had a continual flow of impact position players coming up and knocking on the door for a regular job. And I think that hurt the depth. It just hurt a lot of things in 1969. Unfortunately, at the time, the media's emphasis was on the manager of the team. So all the conflicts and all the controversies were between the media and Leo Durocher, and not the front office, not the general manager, not the development system. And certainly, they didn't name brickbats at Phil Wrigley, who was one of the most accessible captains of industry around. You could call him at the office or call him at his Lake Geneva mansion. So that whole thing was an underdeveloped player development system.
The 1969 Cubs, published by Signature Strength, joining us on the phone lines. We've got Hall of Fame pitcher Ferguson Jenkins, as well as journalist and Chicago sports writer George Castle. Ferguson, to touch back on your time, brief as it was with the Phillies, you write in the book that there might have been an opportunity that in that infamous 1964 season where the Phillies blew literally a 9 or 10 game lead and lost the pennant to the Cardinals, that you thought, had you been brought up then, that you might have made a difference. I'll give you a comparison. The Yankees brought up a young pitcher named Mel Stottlemyre, who passed away in 2019, and he reeled off a bunch of wins that helped save the season for the Yankees. So you kind of saw yourself in a similar situation that could have happened.
I was in Arkansas at the time, the AAA affiliation, and they were using me basically as a relief pitcher. We had Grant Jackson was a starter, Marcelino Lopez. There were a few pitchers that were just waiting to get called up, but unfortunately, in that process, the Phillies wanted to stay with their regular team, and 40-man roster, he just didn't fill it.
So in September, in those days, they still brought up 10 or 15 players to round out the roster. It appears to me that without going through the roster, from September 1st on, that they didn't key in on perhaps some spot starters or bullpen extra arms that they could have used.
Well, you're right. That was a big plus. I think Rick Wise was in the organization with me, along with Dallas Green. There were a lot of young pitchers that could have filled that spot, but I think Locke brought up some veterans or made trades. He brought up regular players, Adolfo Phillips, Alex Johnson, Billy Sorrell, some of the guys, position players. But I think at the time, they needed pitching because of the fact that they were facing pretty good ball clubs.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned in the book, Ferguson, that Bob Gibson was probably your toughest competitor in 1969. Who besides Gibson, you can't get much better than that, but who during your career would you say was probably your biggest nemesis that you faced over your lengthy career?
Well, Tom Seaver was there with the Mets. Kuzman, another left-hand pitcher with the Mets. Juan Marichal, Gaylord Perry with the Giants. Mike McCormick. And then when you go out a little further or south, you get Don Drysdale with the Dodgers. The Cubs had a tough time against Koufax and Drysdale.
George, why were the Cardinals, of course, a team that I remember as a young boy, 67-68 World Series champs, and lost in 7 to the Tigers and Mickey Lolich in Game 7 in '68. Why were the Cardinals not a factor during that '69 season?
Well, I think they got hurt by the loss of Orlando Cepeda. They traded Orlando Cepeda to the Braves for Joe Torre, and while we know Joe Torre was a great ball player, Orlando was pretty much the team leader. Fergie can confirm that. He Cha-Cha, they called him, of the 67 and 68 Cardinals. He was the last of the building blocks for that for those two pennant winners. And I think they lost something with Cepeda. Also, in that big ballpark, Old Bush Stadium was 3 years old. It was hard for the Cardinals to hit home runs, so they were having trouble scoring runs, even though they still had fantastic starting pitching with Gibson, Steve Carlton, Nelson Briles, and others. The Cubs got off to a very, very hot start while the Cardinals were mediocre. And at the beginning of that season, nobody thought of the New York Mets as a contender. The Mets had this great young pitching staff, but most prognostications, and Fergie can confirm this, thought that maybe the Mets would improve and maybe be a 500 ball club. But, many of the Cubs felt the Mets just had a very, very weak pitch and putt type of lineup, and everybody was waiting on the Cardinals to get hot. And in fact, in August, the Cardinals briefly passed the Mets into second place. They were about 8 games behind the Cubs. And Harry Carey on KMOX radio, his last year as the Cardinals announcer, began singing, "Hey, Cubbies," and he knew we were listening through that humid night to the KMOX signal with the Cubs playing during the day. He said, "Hey, Cubbies, the Cardinals are coming, tra-la, tra-la." Well, that lasted just about a week, and then the Mets got hot. But it wasn't really until mid-season where people started thinking seriously of the Mets as a contender.
Ferguson, your road roommate during those early Cub years, if I understand correctly, was Ernie Banks, Mr. Cub. Share a memory of your time knowing this fellow Hall of Famer.
Well, Ernie was an individual that never talked about himself. He just wanted to go out there and play first base and do a great job. I think the biggest thing that people really don't have the idea that Ernie was playing with a bad hip for a while. He had a bad knee. He was in his late 30s. But you had to rip that uniform off and not to put him in the lineup. And that's what Leo had to do. Leo had to put him in the lineup. I mean, when you thought the chips were down, he did a double or he did a home run late in the game. Ernie just had that ability to play well when everybody thought that his career was over.
You think, and you weren't there at that time, I believe, when he was shifted from shortstop. Again, for those who don't remember Ernie Banks' playing days, this was like watching, A-Rod or some of the other great shortstops that in some cases transitioned to DH or third base. I believe it was the early 60s or mid-60s when they transitioned him to first base. Do you think that his career was lengthened by moving to first base as opposed to staying at short?
Yeah, I think so. I think Ernie probably lost a couple of steps as a shortstop, but he had a great arm. He could field. He had a real soft glove, so that's why they put him in first base. But that would lengthen his career because of the fact that those 2 MVPs he won was early in his career, and now they put him at first to really round out the infield with Kessinger, Beckert, Banks, and Santo.
Yeah, tremendous position playing. I mean, again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but as Fergie just said, I mean, practically an all-star at every position. Just remarkable, especially compared to today's game, which is run differently, handled differently, and things are processed differently, if that makes any sense, because of the huge dollars that are attached to players. George, that 69 team, I did a little research. In the book, you mentioned it started off 11-1 and was 40-18 by June 14th. And my math still is pretty good. And it seemed that from June 15th on, the team basically played 500 ball the rest of the way. In your opinion, George, what happened?
Well, let me first add something to the Ernie Banks narrative. He was the oldest regular in the National League that year at age 38. And he and Ron Santo were 1-2-2-1 in the National League in RBIs going to the All-Star break. And what's kind of forgotten is that Ernie's good start cost Fergie a berth on the National League All-Star game in Washington, D.C. Fergie was leading the National League in victories. I believe he had 13 at the time. And Warren Giles, who was in his last year as the National League president, suggested that Ernie, for his meritorious service and production, should be added to the All-Star team as a backup to Willie McCovey. So when they did that, it cost Fergie his spot on the All-Star game, the entire Cubs infield. Ron Santo at third, Don Kessinger at short, Glenn Beckert at second, and Ernie Banks at first. They all made the team. So did Randy Hundley. Unfortunately, Fergie did not. So, but Fergie he wasn't deprived of All-Star mentions and All-Star berths in future years. But that's how good Ernie Banks was in the first 4 months of that season. Now, you talk about the 40-18 start. No, the Cubs did not have any serious slumps the rest of June, July, and actually August was a pretty good month for the Cubs. They went on a 7 or 8 game winning streak, I believe. On the road, they swept the series in Houston, which was very hard to do in the Astrodome. And through a 11 game homestand at the end of August, through Ken Holtzman's no-hitter on August 19th against the Braves, one of only 3 no-hitters without a strikeout in history, the Cubs got to 32 games above 500 at their peak. And it took another 15 years for a Cub team to get that far above 500, 1984 when they finally won the division. But it was this homestand in August after the Ken Holtzman no-hitter where the Cubs really ran into trouble. And the first serious media talk of the players being tired came up. Richard Dozier, who was the beat writer for the Chicago Tribune, asked Leo DeRocher after a game while he was shaving in his office, do you think the guys are tired? They're not hitting? Do you think they need a break? And Fergie certainly will remember this. He was right there. Leo put down his razor, had all the writers walk out into the middle of the clubhouse from Leo's office, demanded all the guys get out of the showers, and had Richard Dozier ask that question again to all the players, are you tired? And of course, no, not one player admitted it publicly to DeRocher, or I should say publicly to Dozier, although afterwards Billy Williams confessed to Dozier that, yeah, we're tired, but we've never gotten this far in first place with this group. We've got to keep pushing on.
Fergie, the team traded away Joe Niekro early in that 1969 season. Was that a mistake in your opinion?
Well, Joe was a good young pitcher. Unfortunately, we had an opportunity to get I think he went to Minnesota for a left-handed hitter. I'm not sure if that's correct or not.
Actually, I'll say they actually traded Niekro to the Padres for Dick Selma, who the Cubs had liked. Selma had been an up-and-coming pitcher with the Mets prior to that year, and he was let go in the expansion draft to the Padres.
That's right, Padres, yes.
All right.
Yeah, but there's a young arm that certainly could have. Not that Selma didn't do some good things, but again, as you well know, Dick Selma's career unfortunately didn't last as long as Joe Niekro. Joe, despite carrying nail files and other tools in his in his glove, whatever, certainly as the younger of the Niekro brothers, certainly had a distinguished career with the Houston Astros, among other teams, as well as Minnesota. You were right, I believe he did play for Minnesota at one point. But do you think, yeah, that would have been an extra piece that could have been used late in the season?
Well, I think Leo was going to stick with the 2 veterans, especially we had Abernathy and Phil Reagan. I think we also had Bob Johnson and a couple other older pitchers. Leo kind of left the bullpen to veteran ability, and unfortunately, in some cases it worked, in some cases it didn't.
Now, center field was what I think, and correct me if you gentlemen disagree, was a problem for the Cubs during '69. Were there any attempts that either one of you know of from your dealings with Mr. Holland before his passing, or of course Fergie being there, on the team day to day? Were there any attempts that you were aware of, maybe to shore things up either defensively with a little more offense? No offense to Don Young and Jimmy Qualls, but I'll give you a comparison. The Mets, how they pulled it off, I don't know. They went mid-season and acquired Don Clendenin, which proved to be a major catalyst for them. Were there any names floated about, maybe even Clendenin, that there was talk maybe of bringing someone in to help that center field situation?
Let me jump in, Larry, that before the season, John Holland said anybody who we talk trade with wants a member of our core. They want a Don Kessinger, they want a Glenn Beckert, and they want a Billy Williams. So what the Cubs were waiting on in that year, and it was unfair to the young guy, was the development of Oscar Gamble. And this was a problem with John Holland. He was impatient. He's an impatient general manager coming and going. Oscar Gamble had been signed out of high school in Montgomery, Alabama in 1968. Buck O'Neill had found him, the legendary Hall of Famer. And normally a guy like that would have 3 or 4 years in the minors, but by the spring of 1969, DeRocher and Holland were really overhyping Oscar Gamble, even comparing him to the next Willie Mays. And rather than having him play in high A ball or something to get his feet really wet, they advanced him to Double A in San Antonio at age 19 and called him up at the end of August after all these other center fielders had been found wanting, and stuck him in a center field in the middle of a pennant race. I thought that was very unfair to Gamble. Plus, he had a very, very active social life, and he was dating white girls at the time, which was an extreme no-no in most of baseball. And he got himself into trouble with DeRocher and Holland for that. And Fergie and Billy Williams, Gamble was up there so quickly that they didn't have a chance to caution the guy, put the brakes on your social life. You have a job to win. There are certain things, even though you're north of the Mason-Dixon line, there's certain things you don't do in the majors at that time.
We got a quote here attributed to owner of Phil Wrigley. Quote, "The closer we came to winning, or the closest we came to winning, was under DeRocher in 1969. The players hated him." Fergie, any comment on that?
Well, I don't think the players hated DeRocher. There was some conflict from time to time with playing certain people, not giving maybe a certain person a rest, pitching myself with 2 days rest. A lot of times it got to the point where Leo wanted to win a series. That could mean winning 2 out of 3 games or winning 3 out of 4. So he would put one of the veterans later on. I think we were considered veterans after 4 years. Maybe Bill Hands or myself, or using Kenny Holson as a pinch hitter. He just did a lot of things that were questionable, but in his eye, it was supposed to help the ball club.
Yeah, Leo wanted to win so badly. I confirmed this 20 years ago with his then wife, or his wife in 1969, Lynn Walker Goldblatt DeRocher, because Leo had actually been investigated by Bowie Kuhn after that season. Bowie didn't like what went on, how he saw Leo handling the team, including starting Fergie on 2 days rest and keeping him in to bat when he was behind 6-1 in the game in the 5th inning. But Leo was cleared by Kuhn of any suspicion of wrongdoing. But Lynn Walker Goldblatt DeRocher said he just wanted to win in the worst way. Fergie and I agree with that. And he just did not trust anybody but his frontline players, which means he didn't use a third of the roster. And you have to do that. Gil Hodges was forced to do that because other than Tommy Agee and Cleon Jones and Bud Harrelson at shortstop, he really didn't have 140, 150 game regular type players at any of the positions. So Hodges had to use all of his roster, whereas the Cubs' evaluation was that we had the best players at our positions on the field. And Blake Cullen, who later became a National League official, told me this, that even a few years going forward from 1969, they kept evaluating that the Sanos, Kessingers, Beckerts, Hunleys, and Williamses were the best at their position, and that filtered to DeRocher. And so he felt he had to play his best. And it turned out to be a disaster thing. But I agree there with Fergie. One other thing, the players did not want to come out of the lineup. Ron Santo, despite unregulated type 1 diabetes, except for 1 year he was hit in the face by Mets pitcher Jack Fisher and missed a week. From 1962 on, Ron Santo, despite having to deal with diabetes every day, not knowing his blood sugar, played 160 games or more. That was by his choice.
We're talking baseball with Hall of Fame pitcher Ferguson Jenkins, along with journalist and co-author George Castle. The book, The 1969 Cubs, here on Studio 411. Ferguson, during your career, I was going through, I knew the teams you had played with in between your stints with the Cubs. Compare, if you would, maybe there is no comparison, the managerial abilities of your Cubs manager, Mr. DeRocher, and one of your Texas Rangers managers, Billy Martin. Any similarities, or would you say total opposites?
Pretty similar. Really knew the game well, hard-nosed, would change position players from time to time, wanted to give you that opportunity to win. He was I think Billy and Leo combined didn't like players that had excuses. Own up to what you're supposed to do. Own up if you did something wrong. Own up to playing well. He didn't like people to sit back and let the other team take offense. You know, I think that's a true side of a winner. And Billy and both Leo were like that. They were almost like two peas in a pod.
Now, Leo, of course, late in his life, or it might have been, George, correct me if I'm wrong, Leo might have actually gotten in after his passing. But would you gentlemen say that Billy Martin, who of course managed with Texas, Oakland, Minnesota for 1 year, as well as several stints with the Yankees, would you say that Billy is a Hall of Fame manager? We'll start with George.
I'd say not. I think that you have to consider character there. Billy was a very, very bad alcoholic. There was a Facebook discourse just the other day with a guy, the son of former major leaguer Jim Brewer, who in his 5th major league game, because he had thrown close to Martin and didn't mean it, Martin went out to the mound. He was playing with the Reds in 1960 in Wrigley Field, and he clocked Jim Brewer in the jaw, broke his orbital bone, and you look back at his leading Mickey Mantle astray, like Mickey needed to be led astray, but Billy made it worse. I think character amounts for something, and to me, Billy Martin doesn't pass the smell test for that. I frankly have questions about DeRocher, because I think DeRocher was overhyped by working in New York. He had only 1 World Series victory and had 3 pennants among the 4 teams he managed. Billy Southworth of the Cardinals won 3 straight pennants and 2 World Series between 1944 and 1942-44 with the Cardinals. Does anybody hear about Billy Southworth?
Ferguson, your opinion?
Well, I think they both were characters on and off the field. Both were infielders. Both didn't take a backseat to anybody, sliding with spikes up, wanting to maybe cause some turmoil from time to time. When it came to, and this is a true story, if one of our ball clubs and players on the team got knocked down, it was the opposing pitcher that was pitching that day was to retaliate. And both managers, they love to see that, because the fact that if you didn't retaliate, your team just didn't have the confidence in you. And Bill Hands was the type of pitcher that would knock people on their butt. I did it a few times, but that was something that you had to do, to retaliate, because you didn't want to have another ball club kind of ease into the situation by saying, oh, he won't knock us down. But you have to retaliate. And those two managers love to see that.
One other thing, and then we'll move on with DeRocher and Billy Martin. another thing that struck me, of course, seeing them both manage, et cetera, over the years, both gentlemen, and I know Joe Torre got accused of this, I don't necessarily agree, of overusing starting pitching. Ferguson, Billy and Leo, would you say that they overused pitchers in general, or was it more specific to relievers, starters, or neither?
Well, I think that by far, with a four-man rotation, you got 3 days off. And we ran and we throw back in between starts. So I thought that was enough rest for me because of the fact that I had a strong arm. I know Billy Martin was similar. I know the year I was with Texas, I got 42 starts. He thought that I was capable of going out there, and that was the 74 season where he won 25 games. He gave me the ball, let me pitch. And I think by far Leo, we had older individuals in the bullpen. Abernathy, Phil Reagan, Bobby Johnson, Kenny Johnson, and a few other guys that I think that in some cases he might have overworked the bullpen just a bit.
I have to mention as we tape, Phil Regan, 80-plus years young, God bless him, just named an interim pitching coach of the New York Mets. What'd you think of that, Ferguson?
Yeah, I heard that. I think that he could probably add a plus to their coaching staff because he knew how to play, he knew how to pitch in crucial situations, and by far, he was a kind of an individual that could strike people out from time to time. But there was sometimes he pitched a contact, but he knew the game, and I know he's trying to help that pitching staff.
As he was nicknamed in his playing days, the Vulture. So we wish him the best of luck.
Larry,
yes.
On the issue of overworking pitchers, specifically with 69, Fergie started on less than 3 days rest on two different occasions. One, of course, is the Black Cat game at Shea Stadium. That was necessitated, not necessarily by Leo wanting, to get more of Fergie. He had to do it. He was in a bind because Ken Holtzman, Leo was trying to work around the Rosh Hashanah holiday. The Black Cat game was on a Tuesday. Holtzman would have started that game, but then his next start would have been on Rosh Hashanah. He would have had to miss it. So he moved Holtzman back one day to start against the Phillies in Philadelphia so that he could then pitch Sunday after Rosh Hashanah in St. Louis. So Fergie had to draw the short straw and fill in against Tom Seaver. It didn't work. There was one other time where Fergie was knocked out early in a game. Willie Crawford hit a line drive off his hand, and Vince Scully had the greatest line about it. I have a Vince Scully broadcast from July 29, 1969. He said all of Chicago held its collective breath as Fergie took his x-rays, and they were found to be negative. So found to be negative, and he had only pitched like less than 2 innings. They brought him back. Pete Reeser filling in for an AWOL DeRocher brought Fergie back after 1 day's rest, and it didn't work out again. But on still one other occasion, Fergie turned down the chance to start on short rest, pitched his normal 3-day rest, and pitched a great game against the Reds. But the guy he really abused, even more than that, was Dick Selma, who started on short rest on several occasions, relieved in both games of a Sunday doubleheader against the Astros in late July. Then the Reds came in for Monday and Tuesday games, and DeRocher slotted Selma in to start the Tuesday game after appearing in both games of Sunday's doubleheader. Selma lasted less than 2 innings, and his season was shot after that. So he did overwork Selma specifically on the starting rotation and overworked Phil Regan, the closer.
Hall of Fame pitcher Ferguson Jenkins, as well as journalist, author George Castle, co-authors of the 1969 Cubs, published by Signature Strength. For more information, www.signaturestrength.org. I had to mention this because I said, well, at least I can say I've had one Globetrotter on. For 3 seasons, you were a member of the Harlem Globetrotters, Ferguson. I was quite impressed, something I did not know about you.
I played from 67 to 69 with Curly Neal, Meadowlark, Leon Hilliard, Jackie Jackson, to name a few of the fellas. It was a lot of fun to play. I wasn't a bad athlete on the basketball court, but I was one of the guys in the skit that gave up the home run each night to Meadowlark Lemon. So that kind of fit in with baseball and basketball. But I enjoyed myself. I played the third quarter every night, about 15 minutes. I think it kept me in pretty good shape.
And as you talk about in the book, the extra change certainly was very welcomed.
Yeah, it was. I mean, making a salary with the Globetrotters was apropos because the fact that the Cubs didn't pay a lot of money. I didn't make $100,000 until I won. I think it was 5 years in a row of winning 20 games that I could negotiate with Mr. Wrigley to try to get to a $100,000 plateau.
Just think about it. Now, overall, you won 20 games 7 times, correct?
Correct. Yes.
And I'm thinking after those first 5 with the Cubbies, I'm thinking we'd be talking stock options with Mr. Wrigley, I think. For
that
sure.
just didn't work. John Holland was a shrewd general manager where he would want to work the player because, you had to pay Billy, you had to pay Ernie, Kenny Holtzman, Bill Hans. There was a lot of players that had productive seasons. I wasn't the only one out there winning and having pretty good seasons of winning and hitting 285 to 300. So there were a lot of guys that the Cubs had to pay.
And a quick mention, I wanted to be sure on this. Your dad played in the Negro Leagues. Talk a minute or so about your dad.
My dad was born in Windsor, Ontario, not far from Chatham, where I was born. And he played with 1 year it was the Chatham Black All-Stars. The next year was the Chatham Colored All-Stars. And my dad was a center fielder. He threw left and hit left. And there were a lot of articles written about my father. He led off a lot of times in the lineup. Was a base stealer, had pretty good speed, had a decent arm. And I think 2 years in a row they won the OBA title, barnstorming in Ontario.
Now, besides Chicago, Ferguson, what were your favorite baseball cities for entertainment on either after games or on days where maybe you guys were off during a series? Obviously, Chicago was your kind of second home, but what other cities during your playing days did you enjoy visiting as a player or as a visiting player?
Montreal came in the league in the mid-60s. Montreal was a good city, being in Canada. Los Angeles, by far, was a great city, and also New York. There were a lot of clubs, entertainment, shows that you could go see. And by far, Billy and I and Ernie and quite a few of the guys, we found good restaurants. And that was the number one thing, was food more than anything else. Shopping for clothes sometimes is good, too. Houston was a good city to shop for clothes, Atlanta. But I think restaurants and places to eat and relax were some of those great spots in New York, L.A., and Montreal.
And now just more for a historical point of view, in those years when you came up in '66 and onward, even though, again, for folks who don't know, Ferguson is the first Canadian Baseball Hall of Famer. Now, did you find during those early years, perhaps even in the minor leagues, you mentioned some of the cities you were in, did you find a certain amount of prejudice that you wish to touch upon as a ball player in some of those perhaps more southern cities?
Well, it started off in Miami in 1962, and players of color or just people of color couldn't go to Miami Beach. There were certain cities, Palatka, Florida, Lakeland, Florida, Tampa, Florida, were a little tough to get restaurants to eat in. But other than that, I played in Chattanooga in the Southern League for a season, and then I also played in Little Rock. 5 players of color played in Little Rock at one time. Dick Allen included, Marcelino Lopez, Grant Jackson, myself, and I think it was Donnie Perkins. But, you just have to go out there and play the game as well as you can, even though sometimes the fans dislike who the lineups are made for or who's in the lineup, but you just go out there and play the game and try to win.
Absolutely. Amazing that, as long ago as that was, again, as a boy growing up here on the East Coast, that, you hear the stories. I remember stories like folks like Bill White, and of course going back to, Monty Irvin, of course, legendary Jackie Robinson, those stories in the 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever. But, amazing that even into the 60s that some of those prejudices were still out there. We're still out there. I have to tell you, gentlemen, as I said earlier, this book is just a labor of love. I think that folks will just, as I did, thoroughly enjoy it. A quote from Kenny Holtzman of the 1969 Chicago Cubs: "The Cubs were probably the best team not to have won." And I got to tell you, and then a quote from Ferguson, which I thought was very apropos. Quote, "We were all winners. We were all World Series worthy, no matter what the final result says in the record books," unquote, Ferguson Jenkins. I'd like to thank you gentlemen for joining us. George, as always, we thank you, and we look forward to having you back on the show. Thanks for joining us.
I appreciate it, Larry.
Appreciate it.
And Fergie, again, my thanks for making some time for us. By the way, one of your buddies there, Bernie Carbo, says hello.
Bernie, the teammates in Boston. Good
Absolutely, man. Absolutely, and we'll talk some more.
That's worthy of another book.
Absolutely, for sure. You guys hang in there a second, and we thank you for joining us here for this hour of Studio 411. Larry DeSilva's my name. We thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Take care.